Please take notes during this video. You can pause, skip back and rewatch to make sure you have good detail. Today's video is all about shutter speed. In its simplest form, shutter speed refers to the amount of time light is allowed to fall on the sensor or the film inside a camera. Let's break that down. So we're going to start off by looking at the mechanism for this inside an SLR camera. Here we have a cross-section of an SLR and a lens. We have the film or sensor here, our pentaprism, a 5-sided prism that reflects light through to the viewfinder here. The shutter is located here, and finally here is our mirror. When you look through the viewfinder, light travels through the lens, through the aperture, and then onto the mirror. The light is bounced off the mirror, through the pentaprism, and out of the viewfinder so that we can see our shot. When you take a photograph, the mirror flips up, the shutter opens, and then the light is able to hit the sensor or film, exposing your photograph. The length of time the shutter stays open is our shutter speed. Let's look at this mechanism in a little bit more detail before we move on to looking at exposure and the visual effect of shutter speed in our photography. Firstly, I'd like to bring you back round to the movement of the mirror. You may have noticed when you look through the viewfinder as you take a photograph that the viewfinder goes dark for the length of the shutter speed. As the mirror moves upward, the light is redirected away from the viewfinder and through the camera's shutter, causing that momentary darkness. Now let's take a look at the shutter itself. This is a typical shutter taken from an SLR camera. There are two sets of blades, called curtains, one set at the top and one set at the bottom. This is the position of the curtains before you take the photograph. When you take a picture, the first one drops down, opening the shutter, then the second one drops down to effectively close the shutter. So, let's look at the shutter in action. This is a shutter speed of a 30th of a second in slow motion. We start by looking at the mirror, which flips up and out of the way. Then the shutter comes down. Now light is exposing the sensor, and then the shutter closes again, followed by the mirror coming back down. If we compare that 30th of a second exposure to say 1,000th of a second or faster, we can see a clear difference. As the shutter speed gets faster, the second curtain starts to drop down before the first curtain has fully reached the bottom, effectively wiping the exposure across the sensor. Now that we understand how the shutter inside the camera works, let's look at how shutter speed affects exposure. Shutter speed is one of the three components of exposure, alongside aperture and ISO. Shutter speeds are generally represented as fractions of seconds, as we can see in the scale here. Shutter speeds can go as high as 8,000th of a second, but in most light conditions, 1,000th of a second would be considered fairly fast. As we look down the scale, we can see that the numbers are represented with an inverted comma. This inverted comma means a whole second. 1 second in most photography would be considered a very long exposure. However, in some low light conditions, they might involve shutter speeds as long as 30 seconds. Finally, we can see B, or bulb mode. In bulb mode, you can open the shutter for a longer period of time, from minutes up to hours. This is used for specialist creative effects. In terms of exposure, simply speaking, the less light available, the longer you would need to make your exposure, or your shutter speed. The more light, the shorter your shutter speed is likely to be. Much like aperture and ISO, each exposure control has a visual effect. Shutter speed affects the way in which motion is captured. It has the power to freeze fast-moving action or blur motion depending on the shutter speed you choose. Before we look at this effect in more detail, it is important to note that when experimenting with shutter speeds, you may require a tripod. Any shutter speed faster than a 60th of a second can be handheld, but for shutter speeds slower than a 60th of a second, you must use a tripod. Now we are going to have a look at the effects that you can achieve with different shutter speeds when photographing moving objects. Let's start fairly fast at 1,000th of a second. Despite the pinwheel moving fairly fast, it is frozen as if it's still. As we get slower with our shutter speeds, we start to see an increase in the motion visible, shown through motion blur. As we get down to a whole second, we can see that the pinwheel is barely distinguishable and has completely blurred out. Once you've understood the basics of shutter speed, how to control exposure and the visual effects you can achieve, the creative options for your own photography are endless and really exciting. Take a look at some of these examples to get an idea of the kind of thing that you might be able to achieve soon.